So I am now joined by Deepankar Basu. Deepankar is a associate professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's a contributor to Catalyst Journal with his essay From Nehru to Modi, which I highly recommend. And more recently, he's the author of the book The Logic of Capital, An Introduction to Marxist Economic Theory, out now from Cambridge University Press. Thank you so much for joining me, Deepankar.
Thank you for having me.
So just to jump right into it, there exists out there some fairly absurd characterizations of Marx and Marxian economics, like that it's all just about capitalism's impending implosion, or that every explanation is just class struggle. Everything going on in the world to a Marxist is just vulgar class struggle. So since your new book is an introduction to Marxist economic theory, can you maybe begin by describing what's truly distinctive about Marxist economics compared to other economic traditions?
Yeah, I think there are at least three distinctive elements of Marxist economics. One, Marxist economics locates the study of capitalism in the broad flow of history. So it understands capitalism as one form of organizing social production. And it also sees capitalism as a class-divided society, just like feudalism, slave-based societies. So therefore, the first distinctive characteristic of Marxist economics is that it tries to understand how the class-divided society of capitalism gives rise to and is based on exploitation. So the focus on exploitation is one of the key distinctive features. There are two more distinctive features, I would say. First, the second one is that Marxist economics looks at capitalism as a contradictory system. So this comes right from Marx's work, where Marx both highlights the positive aspect of capitalism in comparison to previous modes of production, but it also highlights the fact that the positive aspect, which creates enormous wealth and which can, if distributed properly, address the needs of majority of the population, that is not happening due to the way the relationships of capitalism are organized. So there is that contradictory aspect. It increases the productivity of labor and makes possible enormous wealth creation. But then, because it is motivated by generating profit and not satisfying need, it does not end up satisfying the social needs of that system. So those two are really the key distinctive elements. And the third distinctive element, I would say, which really sets it apart from all other economic traditions, is the focus on crisis. So Marx's analysis of capitalism always highlighted that capitalism is a crisis-prone system. So even though there are periods when it seems to be doing okay, there is, if we look underneath the surface, a crisis tendency maturing, which will almost inevitably explode into a crisis. So if we look at the history of capitalism, every 3-4 decades, it is caught in a deep crisis. So that was also one of the key features of Marxist economics.
Right. And that's different than, like I was saying, this kind of characterization that Marx is just predicting. It's all about a prediction of just the final culminating collapse and finality of the system. That his actual project is largely trying to explain the real social mechanisms that generate those crises.
Yeah, right. I mean, you raise a very important point, and I think it's worth highlighting that in Marx's writing, you never find something like a final demise of capitalism. So there is a rich discussion of various tendencies which lead capitalism to a crisis, but then how the crisis is resolved and what will emerge from that is not something which is predicted. It can only emerge as the result of social action by large groups of people.
Right. So your book is obviously not the first introduction to Marxist economics. Hopefully, people are familiar with some of the other brilliant and worthwhile books out there, such as Paul Sweezy's The Theory of Capitalist Development, Duncan Foley's Understanding Capital, and much of Ernest Mandel's large volume of work was also devoted to trying to make sense of Marxist economics for most ordinary people. But unlike these others, you structure much of your book in the same logical progression as Marx structured his work through the volumes of Capital. Can you maybe explain how Marx's full argument is structured? And, for instance, why it's organized in a way that's not exactly historical, but develops the social phenomena of capital?
Right. Yes. I think that that's an important thing to understand. So Marx had toyed with this idea of writing a magnum opus about the dynamics of capitalism for a long time. And as he was working out the material, he was also understanding how best to present his research, the results of his research to his audience. And between 1857-58, when he really seriously started writing this work, and 1865, when he had more or less completed some first drafts, we see Marx going through several different ways of organizing the work and presenting the work. What finally emerged as the 3 volumes of Capital come from, I think, 2 important ideas that Marx realized. One, he realized after his almost decade-long study of the capitalist system, that the focus of his book, of his work, would be on capital. Mm-hmm. And by capital, he meant a system where sums of money come to the market, purchase commodities, produce some commodities with the purchased commodities, and one of the important commodities being labor power, and then at the end sell those commodities which have been produced for more money. So it is a system which is organized around the need to generate more money by investing money. And this process of what Marx calls value begetting more value, or value in motion, is what Marx understands by the word capital. And Marx's understanding was that capitalism is a system which is a representation of this dynamic, of this logic, of this need. And therefore, the central concept that he wanted to study in his book would be capital. So that was the first thing. The second thing followed from his understanding that if he wanted to present to his readers an analysis of the logic of capital, then it must not follow the historical trajectory in which capitalism emerged, but it must follow the logic of the concepts that are necessary to understand the social structure and dynamics of capitalism as it existed during Marx's time. So that's why he did not really present a historical narrative, but he presented a conceptual structure. Moreover, the conceptual structure that he presented was organized in what Marx called different levels of abstraction. So just like any other scientist, social science also abstracts from various peripheral aspects of a phenomenon and tries to hone down and to come to the basic thing that is comprising a system's logic. And that is what Marx wanted to do in the first level of abstraction that he called capital in general. So there he wanted to understand the pure interaction between the 2 elements that comprise capital. So on the one hand, capital or money, on the other hand, labor, and the interaction of the 2, how it gives rise to various tendencies that we see in capitalism. So volume 1 and 2 of Capital is organized at this high level of abstraction. What Marx abstracts from in this high level of abstraction are 2 things. One, the fact that in capitalism there is not one block of capital but individual capitals who compete amongst each other. So the fact of competition, he abstracted from that. And second, that in capitalism there is the phenomenon of credit. So whereby banks can make credit available to capitalists, can make credit available to households. So those two phenomena Marx abstracted from when he was presenting his analysis of the pure logic of the interaction between capital and labor in volume 1 and 2. And then in volume 3 of Capital, he brings these things which he had abstracted from back into the analysis. And thereby, as we go through the 3 volumes of Capital, by the time we have reached the end of volume 3, we have understood the logic of capital at a very abstract level, but then also have understood how it operates when it is brought down to lower levels of abstraction, where competition between capitalists and the phenomenon of credit also play some important roles.
Right. And like I said a moment earlier, you also structure your book in the same way, that you are walking through, like the title of your book very aptly says, the actual logic of capital, meaning in part the logic of the work itself, of Marx's work, but also of how that social phenomena actually then plays out, getting from the most abstract into the more concrete, that we, expand, even by the end of volume 3, it's still fairly abstract, but anyways, I think it's probably worth maybe just kind of jumping into that analysis and maybe walking through some of it. Again, I think maybe the most, you've already mentioned this, but maybe one of the most kind of other distinctive features of Marx's work is value theory, or at least it's kind of chalked up to be. And there's a lot that's been said about value theory, and it's unfortunate that we don't really have enough time to go into all of the nuances and disputes. There's been a lot of writing that's been written over the last 150 years on this, but could you maybe just explain the basics of Marx's labor theory of value, and then after that maybe distinguish between what you make this distinction in your book between a Marxian objective theory of value versus the more mainstream economic subjective theory of value?
Right. Yeah. So the question of value is really central to economic thinking, and it has been there from very long time. And it really starts with a simple phenomena. So if we observe the world of commodities where things are bought and sold, we realize that in the market, one commodity exchanges in a particular ratio for another commodity. So for instance, let's say the price of a table is $40 and the price of a shirt is $20. That effectively means that 2 shirts can be exchanged for a table. Mm-hmm. So this form of exchange of one commodity for another has been there in existence for a very long time. And people have asked, economic theorists have asked, what underlies this phenomenon of exchange? The question of value is really an answer to this question. What can account for the phenomenon of exchange? And in the history of economic thinking, we see 2 broad approaches. One is the subjective approach, which is the approach of neoclassical economics, which started gaining ground from the 1870s onwards. And then there is an older tradition going back to the writings of Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, which thinks of this, or which provides an answer to this question, which is very different. Mm-hmm. So the answer that is given by the classical economists of Ricardo, Smith, and Marx is that what can explain the phenomenon of exchange and what can thereby account for the value of commodities is the amount of labor that has gone into producing commodities. So that is the tradition's answer, as which emerges as the labor theory of value. On the other hand, the neoclassical tradition, which started gaining prominence from about 1870s, answers the same question by looking at what it calls utility. Mm-hmm. So the answer it provides is that commodities exchange with one another in a particular ratio because different commodities provide different levels of utility to the person who wants to purchase it. Now, utility or usefulness was, of course, recognized by the classical thinkers, Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, as one aspect of a commodity. But they also realized that there is another aspect of the commodity, which is the fact that they can be exchanged one with the other. And thereby, when they say that what can account for the fact of exchange is not utility or usefulness, they want to give an objective theory of value. And thereby, they look at the process of production and at the amount of labor that has gone into producing commodities, the relative amounts. Thereby, their answer is that the relative amounts of labors that have gone into producing commodities can account for exchange, both its qualitative features and its quantitative features. So that's why it is different from the answer of the new classical economists who rely on utility or usefulness, which is after all a subjective feature, because how much usefulness or utility I derive from a particular commodity's consumption really rests on myself. It depends on my surroundings, on my state of being, whether I'm happy, whether it's raining. So the same ice cream that I consume will give me different amounts of utility depending on whether it's a very hot day or it's a cold day. So therefore, utility is really a subjective phenomenon, and therefore the theory of value that derives from utility is a subjective theory of value. On the other hand, the theory of value that derives from the amount of labor that has gone into producing a commodity is an objective theory of value, because production is an objective fact, and labor going into production and the amount of labor going into producing different commodities is an objective fact. Of course, it is a different question how we measure that value, and it might be the case that in some cases measuring precisely the amount of value, that amount of labor that has gone into producing a commodity might be difficult. But nonetheless, it's an objective theory of value. Now, I would like to just add one more thing. So, the labor theory of value, which asserts that commodities have value because and to the extent they have absorbed some productive labor of society, was something that Marx took from the classical economists. But he then brought in more nuances. So he asked, okay, can we say something more about the labor that has gone into producing commodities and that can thereby give rise to value? And there he brought in the concept of abstract labor. And he said that abstract labor rather than concrete labor gives rise to the value of a commodity. He also brought in the concept of socially necessary labor. So he says that at any given point in time, given the technology of production and the intensity of work, the amount of labor needed to produce one unit of any commodity will be more or less fixed. And that is what he calls the socially necessary labor required to produce the commodity. And so he says, when we think about value, we have to think about the social context, the given technology and intensity of work, which will then define how much labor is needed. So to emphasize that, he brought in the concept of socially necessary labor. And finally, he was aware that we cannot just compare 1 unit of a 1 hour of a skilled labor's labor, a skilled worker's labor, with 1 hour of an unskilled worker's labor. So he was aware of this, and he therefore pointed out that there must be a conceptual way to make sure that we convert units of complex labor into units of simple labor. So along with socially necessary labor, abstract labor, and the reduction of complex to simple labor, once we have worked out these three concepts, we have a very solid foundation coming from the writings of Marx for a labor theory of value.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a very clear explanation of that. And I think in some ways it's fairly intuitive insofar as as long as people get wrap their heads around the fact that it's a social concept, that it's socially determined, and the fact that what you produce, the value is largely determined by the social context of in which it's produced and in which it is now competing against other people producing the same thing. That entering into that, the fact that it's something produced for the market, for sale on the market, rather than just something you produce for yourself or for a family member or someone else that you personally or privately consume or enjoy. That it's this social process that's actually largely what is kind of undermining and what or undergirding rather it's actually undergirding, and that makes sense of this analysis and what makes it a social analysis as opposed to and therefore also objective. Even though it's social, it's still objective, even though it's and there's been a lot of literature, and part of your book goes into how to actually measure value, and so I don't think we want to touch on that just right now. It's for maybe another time. And if people want to, I don't know, really lose their mind, they can go down a long list of writing on that. But I think how you've outlined it, I think hopefully makes intuitive sense. And it leads right into kind of the next major important concept, maybe the most important concept within Volume 1 of Capital, which is surplus value. This is, most of the book is just devoted, this 1,000-page book is devoted to explaining the emergence of surplus value, and then ultimately its importance in the process of capital accumulation. I think it's probably safe to assume that most people who've tried to read Marx probably have stopped at Volume 1, maybe not even finishing Volume 1. That's okay. So most people probably come across the concept of surplus value if they're familiar with Marx, but maybe they don't fully appreciate the central role of this concept. So could you maybe just explain the significance of the concept of surplus value to Marx and to the overall analysis?
Yeah. I think there are two ways in which the concept of surplus value is really significant for Marx. The first is that Marx located his economic analysis in the broader understanding of history, what he calls the materialist conception of history, or historical materialism. So in the materialist conception of history, capitalism is understood as one other form of class-divided society. Now, in class-divided society, there is the appropriation of labor effort of one class by the another. That was the central way in which the phenomenon of exploitation was understood by Marx. So Marx wanted to clearly understand and explain to his readers how the phenomenon of exploitation operates in a class-divided society. Now, it is important to understand that Marx was kind of juxtaposing the understanding of exploitation in feudalism, which was very easy to understand because it was transparent, to a much more complex way in which the same phenomenon, according to Marx, was operating in capitalism. So in feudalism, to give a very simple analysis, the lord enforced that the serf would work for 4 days a week on the lord's land, and 3 days the serf would work on his or her own land. So thereby 4/7 of the time of the serf was immediately appropriated by the lord. So the fact of exploitation, whereby the lord appropriated the fruits of labor of the serf, was transparent. It was Marx's claim that the same phenomenon was happening in capitalism. But what was obscuring this was the fact that it was all mediated through the market process and the fact of exchange. So in capitalism, the working class was selling its ability to work to a capitalist for a wage. Marx wanted to show that when the capitalist used the labor power that he or she had purchased and produced a commodity and then sold it in the market, in the process, the capitalist was able to appropriate more value than the capitalist paid to the worker in the form of the wage. So this difference, which was essentially what emerged as the profit of the whole capitalist class, is what Marx understood as surplus value. So this was one of the important or probably the most important aspect of the concept of surplus value, because by demonstrating in a rigorous way that a market-based exchange system can also give rise to the emergence and appropriation of surplus value of one class by another, in this case appropriation of surplus value by the capitalist class from the working class, Marx demonstrated in a rigorous way that capitalism was also based on exploitation of one class by the other, just like previous class-based societies was. So that was the first point. The second point was that Marx understood that the generation, realization, and distribution of surplus value was the primary dynamic of the capitalist system looked at from a macro perspective. So capitalism was about making profits. The source of profit was surplus value, and that is why what the capitalist class did with the surplus value that it realized as profit directly had an implication on how the system would evolve over time. And Marx also analyzed that crisis tendencies that we talked about in the early part, the crisis tendencies that emerge in the capitalist system is also related to either the generation of surplus value or the realization of surplus value. So surplus value therefore had both roles. One, it emphasized that capitalism was a class-divided society, and therefore it rested on the exploitation of workers by the capitalists, in the sense that the working classes' value creation, part of it was taken away by the capitalist class without giving anything in return. And second, that the dynamics of the system, including its crisis tendencies, emerge from these two domains, one where surplus value was generated and another where it was realized through the sale of commodities.
Right. So in Capital Volume 1, which should be noted that it's really the only volume of Capital that Marx properly finished, it comes to this pretty great crescendo towards the end where he's describing the process of accumulation. And this is, of course, the central dynamic of capitalist development and growth. And Marx, like you're alluding to, says a lot more about it in the next two volumes as well. But just sticking to Volume 1 for a second, can you explain what capital accumulation means for Marx? And then coming out of that, because they're linked, what his theory of persistent unemployment is?
Yes. So, as I said, an abstract way to understand a capitalist society is to start with a capitalist or the capitalist class entering the market with a sum of money, using those sums of money to purchase two kinds of commodities: labor power, that is the ability to work, and all other non-labor inputs that are used in production. Then we travel with the capitalist into the factory where the capitalist brings these two elements together, and once they are brought together, the commodity is produced. Then the capitalist returns to the market once again, now not as a buyer but as a seller, because he has finished commodities with himself. So then he sells it. Now, in the process, the capitalist ends up with more money than he started with. And this extra amount of money is the monetary expression of surplus value. That is the part of the unpaid labor time of the workers who actually produce the commodities. Now, once we understand this, and Marx spent a lot of time trying to explain this in the initial volumes of Capital, almost the first 20 chapters, then Marx asked the question, what does the capitalist do with this extra amount of money that he has managed to extract from the working class, the unpaid labor time of working class? And Marx's answer is that majority or the most of the surplus value that has been realized is plowed back into the production process to generate more surplus value. So surplus value has been created and that is replowed back into the production process, which will generate more surplus value. And at the end of another cycle, it will again be reinvested so as to generate more surplus value. So the reinvestment of surplus value into the production process with the aim of generating more surplus value is what Marx calls accumulation of capital. Now, the process of accumulation of capital gives rise to a seeming puzzle. So let's say the capitalists invest all their profits back into production. So what will happen? The scale of production will rise, the demand for labor power will rise. And if this keeps happening over many, many quarters and years, the demand for labor will ultimately outlast or outstrip the supply of labor power. Once that happens, the real wage that is earned by the working class will start going up. And if that keeps going up, it will ultimately start eating into the profits. Mm-hmm. And if this is not checked, then this will lead, in the extreme case, to profits becoming zero. So, of course, this leads to a puzzle because the capitalist system is geared towards generating profits. And if the internal dynamic of the system is leading us to a situation where profits will become zero, then this shows up a deeply contradictory dynamic hidden within capitalism. So Marx asks, is there a mechanism available to capitalism to make sure that the demand for labor power does not rise to the extent that it starts eating into profits and in the extreme push down profits to zero? And Marx's answer is yes. And the mechanism that he talks about is what he calls the reserve army of labor or the relative surplus population. Mm-hmm. So the reserve army of labor is the fraction of the working class which is not currently employed by capitalist firms, but which is potentially available to be employed when necessary. And Marx points out that there we can understand the reserve army of labor as being composed of three parts. One, which he calls the floating reserve army of labor. So this is the part of the working class which moves between employment and unemployment. Sometimes they are employed, and then when there is a recession or a firm closes down, they are laid off and they are unemployed. So this is a floating part of the reserve army of labor which constantly moves between employment and unemployment. Then there is a second big element of the reserve army of labor which Marx calls the latent reserve army. So this is the fragment of the working class which has not yet been tapped on by the capitalist system, but which is potentially available. Mm-hmm. And here he really has two important demographic segments in mind. One, peasant producers. So peasants who own small plots of land and who are able to generate enough income so as to not really come all the way to the market to sell their ability to work. So that is a big fragment. And the second is domestic labor, largely women who for a long period of time, large parts of women were outside the labor force. So Marx calls this segment the latent reserve army of labor, which can be drawn on by capital if needed. And the third segment is the stagnant pool or the stagnant reserve army of labor. These are the part of the working class which has really fallen out of the system, which are workers who have either lost their skills or have, for various reasons, stopped looking for work. So all of these together comprise what Marx calls the reserve army of labor. Mm-hmm. And in chapter 25 of volume 1, Marx gives this fantastic analysis where he argues and demonstrates that fluctuations of the reserve army of labor is the primary mechanism which keeps the real wage movement in check and make sure that real wages do not rise to an extent which will completely wipe out profit. And this was a really a very important and revolutionary concept because it highlighted that the fact of unemployment is inbuilt into the capitalist system. So while it is possible for capitalism to solve the problem of unemployment for short periods of time, over long stretches of time, unemployment as a feature of capitalism is going to be there, because if that mechanism is not available, then capitalism will be in jeopardy, because there will be no mechanism available to make sure that wages do not rise to the extent that is necessary to keep profits not from falling to zero.
Right. I think that's critical, and we probably don't have enough time to go into many of the implications, but politically minded people should obviously recognize the implications of agreeing to this analysis that unemployment is a persistent phenomena in capitalism, and that it's derivative of accumulation, that it's something that comes out of the heart of the logic of capitalism. And so when we think about various social democratic proposals, when it comes to the history of efforts to create full employment, and many of the walls that ran into at key historical junctures, and kind of the when we think of the failure of Keynesianism, I should put that in scare quotes, but just the Keynesianism not having explanation critically in the 1970s to what was going on with stagflation. It might be relevant to study right now. I don't know, just for you guys out there to check that out. But anyways, it is super important, I think, and I'm just overemphasizing the point that you've already made about this critical link and the fact that it is accumulation that is driving this, and not either. It's not sometimes the explanation that you'll hear is that it's workers just asking for too much. That is what ultimately leads to stagnation. Capitalism stagnating and going into a crisis or a recession, a depression, something like that. When in fact Marx is saying, and he was a political revolutionary his whole life. He spent his time, probably a lot more of his later life, instead of writing this book, actually contributing to working class political movements. At the same time, he was saying, look, there's actual inbuilt mechanisms and limits to pushing for higher wages. That doesn't mean you don't do it, but that you have to find a political solution to deal with these certain objective economic structures that are inextricable from capitalism. So for most people, that's where the story ends, because they don't read past volume 1, and it's really unfortunate because there's actually there's a lot of Marxism, there's a lot of Marxian analysis that is essential to the larger argument and the larger theory and analysis that comes in volumes 2 and 3. I think it's worth going into volume 2 for just a second. It gets a bad rap for not being Marx's sexiest contribution, but I, among others, I'm sure, think it's a vital part of the analysis. And there's a lot that can be said and has been said about the schemes of reproduction, which is its kind of central feature towards the end of volume 2. But and I don't think we can go into them in too much depth, but could you maybe explain both the importance of circulation and realization of surplus value, as well as maybe, again, in maybe a broad sense, how Marx understands economic growth within capitalism as something that's nearly ever present, but prone to disruptions, hang-ups, discontinuities, and, like we've been talking about, even pretty regular collapses and crises.
Yes, yeah, sure. So, let's step back a little. So, in volume 1 of Capital, Marx's question is to understand how surplus value is generated and what the capitalist class does with that surplus value. So, one part is to explain how surplus value is generated. Another part is the accumulation of capital, which is when that surplus value is reinvested, what happens? Now, in doing this analysis, Marx had abstracted from an important question, which is the following. Surplus value can only be realized and become part of the capitalist pool of money only when the commodities that have been produced with the labor is sold in the market at an adequate price. Mm-hmm. So the question that how does the surplus value end up with the capitalist is important, and Marx had abstracted from that in volume 1. Mm-hmm. So in volume 2, he comes back to that question. The question whereby he asks, how is it that the capitalist system is able to produce a lot of commodities and then to make sure that all those commodities are purchased at the prices that are necessary to realize all the value? Now, Marx provides an answer to this at kind of two levels. At the aggregate level, the main thing he wants to point to us is that when we look at the bundle of commodities that have been produced in a country, in a capitalist country, in a period of time, let's say in a year, we will realize that all those commodities will be purchased either by the capitalist class or by the working class. Roughly, if we kind of abstract from the state for the part and abstract from international trade for the moment. So the capitalist class will purchase from each other parts of what they have produced as inputs that they will use in their production process. So part of it, the capitalist will directly purchase one from the other. The other part, which will be purchased by the working class, is also ultimately driven by the purchases of the capitalist class. Why? Because the capitalist class decides how much labor to employ. When labor is employed, workers get wage income. With those wage income, the workers go out and purchase commodities for their consumption need. So ultimately, it is the decision of capitalists to invest how much they want to produce, how much commodities they want to produce, which ultimately will determine whether all the commodities that have been produced will be bought. So that is something which was later also highlighted by another economist, Mikhail Kaleski. But Marx already understood this and highlighted in volume 1. So to come back to the question from this first aggregate perspective. In the aggregate, if we look at a capitalist economy, the capitalist economy will be able to purchase everything that it produces at the right price to generate and to realize all the surplus value is if the capitalist class is willing to make an adequate amount of investment. Mm. So therefore, from Marx's perspective, it was crucial and important to come up with and develop a good solid theory of capitalist investment. Now, Marx did not complete that project in volume 2, and I think Marxist scholars need to work on this. It is a project which still needs a lot of work. The second perspective from which that same question Marx tried to attack was to understand what happens when we think of the economy as being divided into departments, what he called departments, and broadly, let's say there are two departments. One department produces machines, another department produces consumption goods. Now, once we think about it a little, it is obvious that the aggregate capitalist economy, as divided into these two departments, will be able to produce and sell everything it produces only if there is a proportionality between how many machines are produced and how many cotton shirts are produced. Mm. So there has to be a proportionality between machines and consumption goods. You cannot produce too much of either because otherwise there will be a glut. And the reason is that a lot of the machines which are being produced will be purchased by the capitalists in the production who are currently engaged in producing consumption goods. And a lot of the consumption goods that are being produced will be purchased not only by the workers in the consumption goods factories, but by workers in the machine goods factories. And so there is an interdependence between the two sectors, and that is why Marx emphasized through what is known as the reproduction schemes that if the capitalist system is to reproduce smoothly over time, where it gets caught neither in a problem of too much demand or too little demand, it must produce consumption goods and producer goods in some proportionality. And we can actually be more precise and work out the algebra and show that there is a specific ratio in which these two departments must be present for the system to smoothly reproduce itself over time. Now, from there, we directly come to the question of growth. So, for Marx, capitalism is a system which is geared towards generating and realizing surplus value. And that surplus value which has been realized is plowed back into the system, which increases the scale of the production process. And thereby, growth is understood by Marx as the size of the flow of value through the capitalist economy over time. And over time, year after year, the size of value increases. And it increases for two reasons. One, more surplus value is extracted from the workers because the working class population, which is employed by capital, increases. They become more productive. And second, because of technological change, commodities are sold more quickly. So the speed with which value traverses the whole process and comes back in monetary form to the hands of the capitalist to be reinvested once again, that speed increases over time. So as more surplus value is extracted and as it is realized in a speedier fashion, the system grows over time. So that was how Marx understood growth. The final thing I would say is that Marx understood capitalist growth as a deeply contradictory process which had the possibility of being interrupted at various points. And the interruption of this generation and circulation and realization of surplus value is what Marx calls the period of crisis. So the crisis can happen if a lot of surplus value has been produced and for some reason the commodities are not being able to be sold. So all that surplus value which was produced is not being realized. If that happens, then in the next period, capitalists will reduce their investment and a lot of workers will lose their jobs and the demand for goods and services produced will fall down further and the economy can then move into a crisis. So that can be one way in which crisis emerges. Another way in which crisis can emerge and interrupt the growth process is if there is conflict in the workplace whereby the capitalist system is not able to generate enough surplus value. And that might then present itself or manifest itself as a fall in the rate of profit that is realized on investment because less and less surplus value is being generated. So Marx understood the capitalist growth process deeply as a contradictory process.
Right. It's for someone coming to this stuff for the first time, it's like in some ways kind of mind-blowing. I think it's one of the most ambitious things within kind of the entire Marxian research project of trying to understand just how the entire system itself is actually growing over time and in what ways it's actually growing and what are the causal inducements of and also the fact that discontinuities, the fact that it is an anarchic system where, you know, capitalist A over here and capitalist B over here might be in conversation, but most likely are not, and they don't need to be in conversation. And every capitalist in the capitalist economy doesn't need to be in conversation saying, I'm going to make this much of this commodity and you're going to make that much of that commodity because I need you to make that much for my inputs. They show up to the market and they hope that they have what they need. And, contracts develop over time. It's not, they don't live in a bubble. But the fact is that like there is no central planning that actually occurs. And yet the economy itself still grows. And that discontinuities can be a crisis, like you're saying. It could also be sometimes it's an opportunity that capitalist looks out and says, "Oh, look, there's actually more demand here for what I'm making, and that's actually a great thing for me. So I'm going to go and increase production. I'm going to go make some more profit." And like, yeah, so it's an incredible kind of analysis, and it's unfortunate that Marx didn't finish. And at some level, it kind of doesn't matter because hopefully people should be doing that work now. But that it's central to this, like you're saying, is still the question of profitability. It's still like the forward thrust still remains capitalists seeking a profit that keeps this anarchic situation moving forward, even if unstable and constantly falling apart and rebuilding itself. It's still something that actually we call capitalism as a coherent thing, in part because of profitability as like this through line through it.
The one thing I think you mentioned, and I think our readers should know, is that Marx did not have the time to complete volume 2 and 3.
Right.
And volume 2 and 3 were notes. But so even though he did not complete it, it is important to realize one thing. Before he finalized the draft of volume 1, Marx had worked out the whole argument. And so volume 1, 2, and 3, Marx had completed, and only then he returned to volume 1 to give it the final polish. Right. So even though he didn't complete it, it is fair to assume that he had worked out lot of the logic, and that's why it is important to read volume 2 and 3. And so, yeah, I mean, that is one thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, turning to maybe Marx's messiest work, which is, again, not his fault. It's he tried his best and he wrote a manuscript, and then his lifelong companion and co-author, Friedrich Engels, ends up publishing volume 3. And it really is a who's who in the capitalist ruling class of, this rogues gallery of how the capitalist class actually distributes the surplus once it's generated. So again, we've spent a good amount of time discussing where the bulk of new profits in capitalism comes from, but then Marx also describes how it's distributed and maybe moreover, the social relations between the ruling class. And this is actually just an anecdote of reading through volume 3 recently. And recognizing that all of these different segments of the ruling class he's describing still hold up, that this is something he's describing in the 1860s, and yet it's still highly useful, both descriptively and analytically, moreover, in 2022. So Marx is not saying that every single capitalist is directly exploiting, that many of them actually have to bargain with each other to get to secure their cut of the surplus. So could you maybe briefly describe how he makes those divisions and how the surplus, again, it's hard to say brief, but but how the surplus is distributed among the capitalist class?
Yes, that is precisely the argument that Marx tries to present in volume 3. And his argument moves in 2 steps. In the first step, he is looking at what he calls functioning capitalists. So capitalists who are either directly involved in the production of commodities, or capitalists who are involved in ensuring that those commodities are sold. So the first group of capitalists is what he calls industrial capital. And the second group of capital is what he calls commercial capital. So industrial capital directly organizes the production of commodities and then hands it over to commercial capital, who then make sure it is sold to the final consumers. So on the one hand, you have, let's say, General Motors making the cars, and then you have a group of shops which then sell those cars. So the first would be industrial capital, the second would be commercial capital. Now, Marx is very clear that surplus value can only be generated in production. So all of the surplus value that is distributed and redistributed, and which we will talk about, is all of them are generated in the capitalist production of commodities. So that is the first kind of location to start understanding how the surplus value will then gradually flow through society and end up with as the income stream of different fragments of the non-working class. Now, within the group of industrial capitalists, there is one important issue that Marx discusses, which is that different types of producers have different capital intensities. So some production requires a lot of labor per capital, per machine, and some other producers or some other commodities require the opposite. They require much more machines per worker. So there is a process by which the total surplus value that has been generated in the production of commodities is, in the very first instance, redistributed between the different fragments of industrial capital. And why is that necessary? It is necessary to make sure that every capitalist in the long run makes the same average rate of profit. Because if there is a segment of production which generates higher than the average rate of profit, then a lot of capitalists will come into that sector. And the production and supply of that commodity will rise. Therefore, its price will fall, and therefore the rate of profit will fall. So we can visualize this process working itself out over a long period to ensure that every capitalist who is engaged in the production of commodities, no matter which line of production he or she is involved in, whether producing cars or producing computers or producing shirts, everybody gets the same rate of profit. Now that juxtaposed to the fact that production of cars might require much more machines per worker than production of shirts means that there is a first round of redistribution of surplus value among the industrial capitalists themselves. So that's the very first step. So that is then handed over, the commodities which have been produced are handed over to the Walmarts and the Amazons who actually organize the sale of the commodities. So Walmart and Amazon do not produce anything. They just make sure that the commodities that have been produced are sold. This category of capital is what Marx calls commercial capital. So Marx's second part of the argument is that what happens between industrial capital and commercial capital is a distribution of surplus value. So if total surplus value was generated equal to 100, there is some process by which that 100 is distributed between the producer who actually organized the production and the likes of Walmart and Amazon who merely make sure that the commodities are sold. So we have thereby understood the first step of the distribution. Surplus value was generated. Part of it is realized by the capitalist who generated it. Part of it is handed over to the commercial capital because commercial capital is functional, because the commercial capital will ensure that the commodity is actually sold. Because without the commodity being sold, the surplus value cannot be realized. And that is why commercial capital is able to extract part of the surplus value. And that is the source of the enormous profits of Amazon and Walmart. Now there the process does not end because Amazon, Walmart and the direct producers like GM need two things. One, they need to borrow money to finance their investments because oftentimes they do not have all the money they require to expand their production, to introduce a new machine, to end up and to make more shops or to expand and the network of shops. Mm-hmm. So capitalists end up borrowing from another group of non-workers who specialize in lending money to the functioning capitalists. And that is what Marx calls the representatives of those as money capital. Mm-hmm. So what happens is that now a process of bargaining happens between functioning capitalists and money capitalists. Part of the surplus value that has been realized as profit of the producing capitalist or the commercial capitalist has to be handed over to the money capitalist as interest income. That is necessary because functioning capitalists need to borrow money from the money capitalists. And the final cut comes from a group of non-working people who have ownership of natural resources like land. Now, since land is required for capitalist production, and think of agriculture that is direct, but also think of mines, think of real estate, think of tourism, all of which requires in one way or another natural resources or access to natural resources. So owners of natural resources, again, are able to bargain for a part of the surplus value from the functioning capitalist who will use that natural resource for producing some commodity and selling it at a profit. And the part of income that is taken by the owners of natural resources, think of land, is what Marx calls ground rent, or we can just call rent. So at the end of volume 3, we have really covered all the important segments of the non-working people, the non-working class, the ruling class, and have understood how the income streams that they live off come from ultimately the unpaid labor of workers, the surplus value. So the first cut is the industrial capitalist, the second cut is the commercial capitalist, the third cut is the money capitalist who gets rent, and the first two groups broadly get what we call profit. And final cut is by owners of natural resources, and their income stream, which is a part or fragment of the surplus value, is known as rent. So that is how we Marx concludes the analysis by showing how surplus value was generated in volume 1 and how it was realized in volume 2, and then how it was distributed and ends up as the income stream of different fragments of the non-working class in volume 3 of Capital.
Right. The very last thing, maybe still kind of staying with volume 3 for a moment, and you've already touched on some of this, but it's because of maybe its omnipresence within capitalism, and maybe also just it's maybe the most deceptively self-evident social phenomena of capitalism. I think it's worth staying on the concept of competition and technical change for just a moment. Obviously, again, as we've said, the fact that everyone is dependent on markets for their survival in capitalism, either as workers in a labor market or capitalists trying to accumulate a profit within a limited commodity market, means that competition is generated from the class structure, and that it's something that it must be dealt with in one way or another within capitalism. And the key thing that comes out of this process of competition is technical change, which is a little jargony, but it's the addition of greater machines and labor-saving devices within the work process. And I think there's been a lot of more recent scholarship on competition within kind of the Marxian economics. And we don't have to touch on a lot of that, but I do think there is something highly unique about Marx's theory of competition and technical change as compared to other schools of economic thought. And part of this is that it comes out of the entire classical tradition. But just sticking with Marx maybe for the moment, how does a Marxist understand competition and technical change in contrast to other economic understandings of these phenomena?
Yeah, right. So I think Marx you are absolutely right. Marx always has the class structure in his view when he is theorizing capitalism, and he makes kind of these 2 points. One, of course, there is the important relationship, the all important relationship between capital and labor. So the contradictory relationship between capitalists and workers. But there is also the contradictory relationship between the individual capitalists or groups of capitalists within the whole the capitalist class. And the interaction between them is what we can understand as the process of competition. So, capitalists individually and as a group are interested in generating and realizing more and more surplus value. Now, since capitalism is not a planned system, each individual capitalist is not always trying to coordinate his or her action with other capitalists. In fact, the opposite is mostly the case. Individual capitalists within one industry, different capitalists, or capitalists in one industry versus capitalists in another industry are always trying to compete with each other to outdo the other to generate more profit for himself or herself. So the process of fierce, unrelenting, continuous competition is a fact of life of capitalism. And Marx spends a lot of time understanding, describing, and analytically understanding this phenomena. So the process of competition, if we think about it, between two capitalists, the capitalist who is able to reduce the cost of production will be able to win the competitive struggle. Why? Because an individual capitalist who produces the same commodity for a lower price, for a lower cost, will, on selling at the going market price, be able to generate more surplus value and more profit. And thereby, by reinvesting that surplus value or profit into the production process, will be able to increase the size of his capital base, will be able to increase or improve the techniques of production used. So in one sentence, in the competitive struggle, the capitalist who is able to reduce the cost of production is going to win the competitive struggle. And therefore, inbuilt into the logic of capitalism is a need for capitalists to continuously search for newer methods of production which can reduce the cost of production. Now, once we realize this, we also need to realize that one of the most important elements of cost for the capitalist producer is the wage cost, because labor is one of the most important elements to production. And therefore, the competitive struggle leads directly to the search for new techniques of production which can reduce the amount of labor used to produce every unit of output. And that is the kind of secret for a tendency that we have observed for long periods of time, which is the emergence of labor-saving technical change, whereby capitalist systems continuously improve on the methods of production by saving labor and increasing the non-labor input in place of labor. So the process of competition, which is inherent to capitalism, thereby leads to a particular feature of technical change. So this was a very important part of the analysis of capitalism by Marx. And what is striking is that empirical evidence for long periods of time, and even today, completely validate Marx's understanding of the necessity of technical change and the feature of technical change, whereby there is a pronounced tendency for labor-saving technical change coming into the play over and over and over. So this I find to be a fascinating feature of Marx's analysis, which is absolutely relevant to understanding the history of capitalist technology and also to understanding the current period of capitalism.
So maybe just to wrap up, because we've said a lot, and I greatly appreciate your time and your insights. Maybe, the fact that we didn't actually get really to the second half of your book, which is all about essentially those things that have been left unfinished since Marx wrote Capital Volumes 1, 2, and 3, and the debates that have ensued, the various kind of strands or influential kind of points of view within Marxism arguing for different ways of understanding either kind of the Marxian analysis or just kind of taking Marxism and trying to use it in the world and try to make sense of empirical facts. And could you maybe say what was left unfinished when Engels published the last part of Capital, and in just broad brushstrokes, like what the nagging debates have been within Marxism, and are they done? Do we have Marxism? Is it a full thing yet, or like are we there yet, or are there going to be more debates in the future? Where do we go with Marxism?
So it's interesting. So right after Volume 3 was published, there was a lot of critical attention on a question which has generated a debate right up till today. So it's a debate which starts in the 1890s and it's still going on. It's difficult to say that it will end. In my opinion, there is a pretty solid, robust, rational response to some of those questions and issues which were left unfinished by Marx. So what is this question I'm talking about? So in Volume 3, Marx talks about prices. What he calls prices of production are the prices which in the long run will ensure the same average rate of profit for all lines of production of capitalist commodities. Now, Marx had so far done his analysis in terms of value, and we know value is broadly the socially necessary abstract labor time required to produce a commodity. So the question naturally arose, what is the relationship between the value of a commodity and the price of production of a commodity? And Marx tried to give a way to understand these relationships, which worked through the concept of redistribution of surplus value. So here I'll go back to something I said earlier. So think of the production of cars and the production of, let's say, shirts. Let's say the production of cars is much more capital intensive. So that means that for every dollar invested in the production of car, less amount, a smaller fraction goes to hiring labor power. And if we turn to the production of shirt, for every dollar invested, a larger fraction goes towards hiring labor power. Mm-hmm. Now, if we go with the labor theory of value, what does that imply? It implies that in the production of shirts, more surplus value will be generated than in the production of cars, because a larger fraction of every dollar in the production of shirts is used to purchase labor power, and labor power is what generates value, and out of that value, a part of it is taken by the capitalist and therefore more surplus value. Now, the question is, will a capitalist who is producing cars be content with generating and producing cars if he only makes 10% rate of profit, whereas in the production of shirts, capitalists are making 25% rates of profit? Mm-hmm. Well, that is not going to happen, because capitalists who are producing cars will gradually move into producing shirts, and they will increase the production of shirts. So therefore, when we think of capitalism in a long-term perspective, a good approximation is to think that every line of production will generate the same average rate of profit. Now, if the same average rate of profit has to be generated in the production of cars and shirts, then that necessarily means that the price at which a shirt will sell will be very different from its value, and the price at which a car will sell will also be different from its value, because only by a redistribution of part of the surplus value generated in the production of shirts and moving it to the production of cars will every unit of capital be able to earn the same rate of profit. So Marx therefore said that his theory suggested that there is necessarily going to be a deviation of the values of commodities and the prices of commodities. Mm-hmm. And that is a robust and correct insight. But in working out some of the examples, Marx made some algebraic errors. And people who were critical of Marx's general framework caught on to those errors and have claimed ever since that Marx's value theory is internally consistent and that it cannot be corrected. Mm-hmm. So one point of debate which has been there right from 1890s till now is what is known as the transformation problem, which is trying to come up with a coherent explanation for the relationship of prices and values. I think there is a very coherent and good way of understanding this relationship, but of course, many scholars disagree, and so the debate continues. So that's one. The second point, which has generated enormous debate, relates to the question of technical change. And again, it emerges from volume 3, because in volume 3, Marx had made a very strong claim that the progress of technology in capitalism will necessarily lead to a tendency for the rate of profit to fall. If that happens, that means that capitalism's strength, which is technical change, is also its primary weakness, because the process of technical change is leading to the rate of profit falling, and ultimately that is going to lead to a stagnating or zero growth capitalism, because capitalists are not interested in producing if they are not able to make a certain rate of profit. So Marx's claim that there is a tendency for the rate of profit to fall over time in capitalism has again generated enormous debate. I think there is a fairly good way to resolve the issue, but again, different scholars think differently, and so the debate continues. Mm-hmm. So those were two, I think, long-standing debates, and I discussed those in the second part of the book. Another issue which has been discussed a lot, which is really not in volume 3 but volume 1, is the question of domestic labor, and a lot of Marxist feminists and feminist scholars have raised that issues. That is, I think, a very important issue, has generated a lot of discussion and debate. The central question is, does domestic unpaid labor, which happens within the household for care work, for producing food that the family will consume, does that create value and surplus value? Again, that I think there is a way to understand that which is consistent with how Marx understood and how we can broadly understand capitalism, but many scholars disagree, and there is a long-standing debate. So I think those three I would point out as important long-standing debates that will probably keep going. We don't really have an end, but there are fairly good ways to answer those questions.
Well, if you want the answers to those questions, you should buy the book. It really is a fantastic book. I really think it's like probably the best introduction that the left has to approach Marxist economics right now, and that if more people read it, we would all have a very solid floor to be able to actually answer these and further questions in more nuance and in more complexity. And thank you. I guess part of this is saying thank you for writing the book. I appreciate your contribution. Hopefully Cambridge will be nice enough to release a paperback at some point soon for people that is not so crazy expensive. So, just word to Cambridge. But thank you so much for your time, Deepankar Basu. People should check out his new book. Again, the title is The Logic of Capital, An Introduction to Marxist Economic Theory. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.